On today's show, we take a look at new Houston Rockets head coach Ime Udoka, some of his basketball philosophy, team building principles, all that as it compares to former Houston Rockets head coach Stephen Silas, and some of the key differences, as well as maybe some parallels that we can draw between those two, as well as when we can expect the introductory press conference for Ime Udoka. All that and more coming up right here at Locked On Rockets.
This is Mission Control, Houston.
Ignition sequence start.
The Houston Rockets select Jalen Green, Alperen Sengun, and Jabari Smith Jr.
T-minus 15 seconds. Guidance is internal.
Every time I step on that floor, I'm coming.
Hey, Houston fans, I am so happy.
You're getting somebody who's going to come in with a chip on their shoulder, somebody who's going to come in and compete from day one.
6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
What's up, and welcome to another edition of Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. As always, I'm your host, Jackson Gatlin, native Houstonian and credentialed media member. I'm also the host of Locked On NBA Mondays. Be sure to follow along on Twitter at JT Gatlin. And the show, of course, at Locked On Rockets, free and available wherever you listen to your podcasts, including YouTube. Just go to YouTube, search Locked On Rockets. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Now, today's episode is brought to you by GameTime. Download the GameTime app and create an account. Use code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your very first purchase. Last-minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. And as always, thank you so much for making Locked On Rockets part of your day every single day. If you're an everydayer, drop a comment in the YouTube section. If you listen to the show every single day, whether it's on the way to work, on your lunch break, on the drive home, at the gym, thank you so much for making Locked On Rockets part of your day every single day. Joining us now is your weekly co-host, none other than Rockets Wire editor and host of the Logger Line podcast, the podfather himself, Ben DuBose. You can follow on Twitter at Ben DuBose. Now, he might be presenting himself as a Chelsea fan on today's show, but I know that Ben is probably a big fan of the hire the Houston Rockets just made at the head coaching position, Ime Udoka. Ben, are you as excited about this as I am? Oh, you know what? It's being blocked by your microphone. Okay, that's my bad. Okay, so I can clearly see the Chelsea logo on the hat, with the Rockets logo maybe took astray by the wayside with the microphone. All right, Ben. Well, look, I had my initial reaction to this hire already. I want to know first, give us your initial reaction to this, and maybe one big takeaway that you have about what this hire means for the team moving forward.
Yeah, so I was out walking on the Bayou Trail when it happened, and I just happened to check Twitter. Thankfully, I did, because as soon as it happened, I fist pumped and then turned around because, of course, I had to go back home and file stories and all that good stuff. It never happens when you're just sitting on a couch with the laptop right there. Never. It's always when you're doing something else. But yeah, I fist pumped because it's a big moment. And for me, more than anything else, it symbolizes that the Rockets aren't just talking the talk, they're walking the walk. Because more than Ime Udoka individually, and what he can do as head coach, this speaks so well to Rafael Stone as GM and Tillman Fertitta as owner. With competition from teams, not just the Raptors, but also future vacancies, Ime Udoka easily could have played it the way Quinn Snyder did last offseason, not entered the coaching market at all, and had his pick of the jobs mid-season that inevitably opened up the way Snyder did with Atlanta. For the Rockets to be able to sell Udoka, number one, it cost a pretty penny. Tillman Fertitta had to be willing to invest, and I suspect he's shown a willingness to invest in the assistant coaching staff as well. We'll see over the coming days what happens on that front. Also, for Rafael Stone, Adrian Wojnarowski of ESPN wrote this in his article. It's a partnership between Udoka and Stone, and Rafael had to outline the vision for not just having all that cap space, but what he is going to do with it. And clearly, Udoka has heard things that he's excited by. So for me, there's been tidbits along the way. We've done shows in the past talking about the Rockets long-term and reasons why we buy in terms of, even though the product the last 3 years has been terrible, when you factor in the potential to obviously change the coaching staff, but now make big moves in the draft, free agency, all this flexibility, you can really remake this team very, very quickly and have them on the up and up in the very near future. It's just a matter of when the time comes, and this offseason is one of the big dominoes in that chain. You've got to be willing to strike, and that's what they did. And we've heard for quite some time that the Fertittas are willing to invest when the time is right. But given the fact that in 2019 they didn't pay the luxury tax. There's some hard feelings amongst many corners of this fan base. And even though they've done some little things like buying second-round picks here and there over the last few years, this is the first really big investment that they've been called on to make. And they did. With Rafael Stone, it's not just what he's going to do with the cap space. That's part of it. But also some of the stories that have been out there about Stephen Silas and interference and those angles. Ime Udoka is not going to put up with that. Spoiler alert, he's got other opportunities that he can turn to if he did not trust Rafael Stone to let him run the on-court basketball the way he sees fit. That tells you that Rafael Stone is willing to trust the head coach, perhaps especially more now that there's a trusted guy who's been there, done that in that role, as opposed to Stephen Silas. And so I think it backs up that some of the stuff this year, while I don't want to necessarily say overdone, it's at least something that can be managed and is not going to be a big hurdle in the grand scheme. So for me, more than Ime Udoka as a coach, which I am excited about, the defensive structure, the accountability, players coach, the relationships in the locker room, all that stuff is great. He's proven he's taken the team to the NBA Finals. I also love what it says about the organization as a whole. This is a big boy hire for Rafael Stone and Tillman Fertitta. And as fans of the Houston Rockets, I think that's the most important thing of all. It's not just about the head coach. It's about the entire organization. This is a big win, and perhaps the two biggest decision makers in your entire organization got it done. Kudos to them.
No, absolutely. Couldn't have said it better myself. I'm very, fully inclined to agree with you there. And one of the things that I want to unpack a little bit, as we navigate today's episode, is some of, the philosophy, I guess, from Ime Udoka as far as his philosophy towards just basketball in general, team building, that kind of stuff. We've got a couple clips that we want to run back from when he was actually introduced as the Celtics head coach a couple years ago that are still probably very relevant today to how he will approach this whole situation, as well as kind of comparing him to Stephen Silas, some of the pros and cons between these two guys and some of the differences, some of the changes that we can expect moving forward with Ime Udoka as the head coach of this team. We're going to get there in just one moment, but first, today's episode is brought to you by GameTime. Look, buying tickets shouldn't be a stressful thing to deal with, right? If you're trying to get tickets to, go to a game or go see a play or a concert or whatever event you're trying to attend, right? You shouldn't be stressing about trying to find your seats, right? You're trying to go out and have a good time. GameTime can help you. It is the place for last-minute ticket sales. Forget having to plan months in advance, right? You can find flash deals and last-minute tickets. It's easy to find and buy tickets for every kind of event in your area. They've got images of your seat, so you know exactly the type of bang you're getting for the buck that you are spending. Snag the tickets without the stress with GameTime. Download the GameTime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your very first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off. Download GameTime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Today's episode is also brought to you by FanDuel, because you got grand slams, no-hitters, and double plays back, and there's no better place to get in on the MLB action than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. That's because right now, new customers can step up to the plate with a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon, sign up, place your first bet, and get up to $1,000 back in bonus bets if your bet doesn't win. Right now, you can take a look at who the odds-on favorites are to make the World Series this season. The Atlanta Braves at plus 550, your hometown Houston Astros at plus 700, the Dodgers at 750, the Rays at 800, and then rounding things out in the top 5, the New York Yankees at plus 900. So for all of that and more action, don't miss your chance to get in on a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 when you join FanDuel today. Just go to FanDuel.com/lockedon to sign up. FanDuel, official partner of Major League Baseball. And continuing on here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. Now, Ben, I think one very interesting kind of sticking point here, and this was something that I think Rafael did a really good job of addressing during his exit interview, and it was an area of maybe some concern during Silas' tenure, right? The fact that he didn't originally select his assistant coaching staff, and then he was finally in his third year, what ultimately became his final season with the Rockets, was able to go out and pick some of the names that he actually wanted on his staff, which gave him a little bit more autonomy as the head coach. That was something Stone mentioned multiple times during his exit interview, stating that it would be up to the next head coach to pick his staff, decide on his staff. And that's something that Udoka was given the freedom to do in Boston. Now, there were some holdovers from the Brad Stevens era of Boston Celtics coaching, Joe Mazzulla being one of those holdovers, as well as a couple other names. But the tree, I went and had to track down these names because I was very curious who these names actually were. There were 4 names that Ime Udoka actually brought into the fold when he was hired in 2021 as the Celtics head coach. And those names were Will Hardy, we should be familiar with, now the head coach of the Utah Jazz, Damon Stoudemire, who's actually teed up to be the next coach of Georgia Tech currently, and then 2 other names, Ben Sullivan and Aaron Miles. And so while Will Hardy and Damon Stoudemire are currently spoken for, and their commitments clearly to the Jazz and Georgia Tech, Aaron Miles and Ben Sullivan are currently still on that Celtics bench, and because those were Udoka guys, so to speak, I think there's a very real possibility that those could be 2 names that maybe Ime reaches out to and wants to bring back to Houston, guys who maybe want to continue coaching under him. And then it's also worthwhile noting, again, the connection that we've highlighted before with James Borrego and his past experience with him. And then lastly, the 2 names that we think about often as to whether or not they'll bridge the gap between the previous era and the Ime era, with John Lucas and Mahmoud Abdel Fattah and guys who might carry over from the Silas regime. So I think this is kind of how the assistant coaching tree kind of plays out with Ime is one of the first things that I look at as far as the main differences here between the start of the Stephen Silas era and the start of the Ime Udoka era.
Yeah, and I think the start of the Stephen Silas era was also defined by the same factors that led them to hire Stephen Silas in the first place, which is the instability of the organization, everybody knowing around the league that this huge iceberg was right around the corner in the form of James Harden forcing his way out. And then who knows what comes next, because it wasn't going to be a quick rebuild if the Rockets went in that direction with no cap space for 3 years, devoid of draft assets. So I think they were largely limited on the assistant market at that time. Beyond whether it was Stephen or Rafael making the hires, it just was not a very attractive organization. As opposed to now, clearly the Rockets have their pick of the litter, not just in terms of the finances, that is part of it, but also just the desirability. People really like what the future of this organization is right now and what the outlook for the next 3 to 5 years looks like. And I'm really excited potentially about the Borrego partnership if they go down that road. We've talked about it before because, of course, Udoka and Borrego spent time together on the Greg Popovich staff in San Antonio. After I heard that Borrego had a really strong interview in Houston, I reached out to a couple of people I trust and asked about whether he would potentially accept an assistant gig, because there are some former head coaches that rather than go down that road will just sort of bide their time taking head coach interviews and wait for the next vacancy as opposed to going the assistant route. And I wasn't sure where Borrego would fall on that chain. He has been a head coach for 4 years, but it was in Charlotte, not exactly a huge pressure-packed environment. So perhaps that makes him more willing to go the assistant route. But what I was told when I asked about it was that while it sounds good on paper, you have to be very careful, because what you don't want to do is a situation where your runner-up for head coach is your lead assistant, and then the head coach is looking over his shoulder in a situation that might be analogous to, remember when the Hawks let go of Lloyd Pierce for Nate McMillan a couple of years ago? Yeah. They brought in Nate McMillan as the assistant, and it's like, oh, oops, sorry, Lloyd, you're out. That's not going to happen here. Udoka is the type of hire. He has such pedigree, such confidence. Everybody knows he is going to have an incredibly long leash, at least on the basketball merits. Now, knock on wood, if something bad happens off the court, then that's different. But again, that's not something you plan on. It's not like, yeah, that would be within Ime's control. So in terms of basketball, the factors that he can control, Ime's not going to be looking over his shoulder. So that may make it all the more possible and realistic for him to really look at big names, including James Borrego. We know Ime has a defensive tilt. This is a great opportunity with your assistants to get someone who can really run the offense and focus on that side of the ball. And so that could be the perfect marriage going back to their time in San Antonio. And the last point I would raise on this, I've seen some people over the last 24 hours since the hire was announced on Monday afternoon talking about Udoka being blessed with a great assistant situation in Boston. Look, as you laid out, a big part of that is the guys that Udoka actually chose. Yes, he had a good assistant staff. He deserves credit for that because over his years as an assistant, and this is where it pays off, people talk about him having just 1 year of head coaching experience. Yeah, but he had 9 on the bench of really good situations like the Spurs, the 76ers, the Nets. He made a lot of contacts. And so the fact that his hires worked that well tells you that he gets it. He has the right connections. He sees the right things in people. And so while certainly the assistant staff is important, I do have confidence that he can potentially build that same type of staff here in Houston, especially as you mentioned, now that he has the autonomy from Rafael Stone to do so.
Yeah, and there are a couple other names on that Celtics assistant coaching staff that we didn't highlight. Tony Dobbins, DJ McClee, and obviously Joe Mazzulla promoted to head coach, who were, again, holdovers from the previous Brad Stevens era. And that's been one of the other things, I guess, I think there's been some just downplaying of what Udoka was able to accomplish with that Celtics team, almost basically saying, well, he was gift wrapped a contender, and, Brad Stevens basically just handed off this, ready-made team to him. And it's, well,
they were 36-36 the year before, 500.
They were, and they, part of that was because they dealt with some injuries, and they had guys in and out of the rotations, and and so I get maybe some of that, but it's just, I don't know. It goes back to the whole, like, okay, was this success just flash in the pan with Udoka, or is it something that you can actually draw upon and extrapolate to, like, he's going to have long-term future success? And I think you look at all the things that he actually did deal with that first season, or that one season, I guess, as the Celtics head coach, and you've got to be really confident moving forward that he is going to be one of those upper echelon type coaches. Again, he was being widely regarded as one of the next up and coming, most exciting coaches in the NBA after the success that he had that season. And I think it is an interesting parallel to draw to Stephen Silas, who had, in his own right, a ton of success with the Dallas Mavericks, was brought in just under very different circumstances back when the Rockets brought Silas in. And you think about, too, the differences in the coaching search, right? How they cast this really wide net. And historically, the Rockets have always cast a really wide net. They've done really thorough coaching searches. And this one is the complete opposite of that, right? They had a very small pool of upper echelon candidates that they wanted to hit. They didn't even wind up interviewing all of them, and they found their guy and immediately went and got him, which is just very different than what we've seen historically.
Yep. 6+ weeks versus 2 weeks. The timeline is a lot. They moved quick here because when you've got your guy on the line, there's no point in waiting, especially because the playoffs are ongoing and who knows what jobs might open up after the first round. No, you go 6+ weeks in large part because you're not necessarily getting the results that you want. So you want to learn more about, I guess, your second tier of candidates, and who knows, maybe something happens to change the marketplace, put somebody on the market that you're not expecting, etc. No, the timeline was expedited here because they got their guy. And by the way, funny story, on Sunday I checked in. So I checked in a couple of times with my people at Toyota Center over the weekend. And on Saturday I asked about the Udoka to the Raptors rumors and if they were confident or if they were concerned, and they told me, no, we're confident that we're the best job on the market, and if we want someone, we can get them. That turned out to be true. Obviously, even with Toronto out there and Nick Nurse fired, Udoka chose the Rockets. He had other options, and I believe that Toronto easily could have been one of them had he opted to go that direction. On Sunday, I asked about Kenny Atkinson because when the report came out that Sam Cassell interviewed, and his team, of course, has been in the playoffs, I wondered why we hadn't heard anything on the Kenny Atkinson front in 2 weeks, other than that the Warriors had given the Rockets permission to interview. Stone cold silence. Did not hear back at all. And I thought that was very odd because at a bare minimum, you at least get a response. And so I sort of wondered, is there something going on here? Is there something behind the scenes? And then, by midday Monday, there absolutely was something going on. Fagan reported that late Sunday night and early Monday was when the agreement in principle was reached. So there's a reason why they did not interview Kenny Atkinson, didn't even get through the tier one, as you said. Ime was their guy, and kudos to them for not waiting around. They went and got the deal done.
Coming up, we're going to get into a couple sound bites, a couple clips that we have from when Ime was actually hired as the Celtics head coach, but clips that probably still hold strong today about his belief system towards basketball philosophy, how he handles players, all that kind of stuff. We're going to get there in just one moment, but first, today's episode is brought to you by Prize Picks. Next game, how about Jason Tatum to score more than 26.5 points? What about LeBron James to have more than 7.5 rebounds? How about Kevin Durant to have less than 6.5 assists? And what about Steph Curry to have more than 3.5 three-pointers made? So what is Prize Picks? It's daily fantasy sports, but how does it work? Basically, you pick 2 to 6 players. If they score more or less than their Prize Picks projection, you can win up to 25 times back on your money on any entry that you submit. There's no competing against other people. It's just you versus the projections available. PrizePicks offers projections on any sport that you watch. That's NBA, NFL, MLB, NHL, PGA, you name it. They've got you covered for all the action over at PrizePicks. Entries can be made in 60 seconds or less. It's that simple. They're safe. They offer fast withdrawals. Currently operational in over 30 states and Canada. So download the PrizePicks app or go to prizepicks.com to sign up and play daily fantasy sports. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with promo code LOCKEDON. If you deposit $100, PrizePicks will give you $100. If you deposit $50, PrizePicks will give you $50. So don't forget to enter promo code LOCKEDON at sign up for an instant deposit match up to $100. And final segment here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast, home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. Now, we are waiting. We don't quite know exactly when the Ime Udoka Houston introductory press conference will be, although we can imagine it'll probably be sometime this week. It's not exactly like they want to wait to announce this hire. I feel like this is one of the first wins that the organization has had in a long time. You can rest assured that they probably want to parade Ime around as the biggest win possible. So I'm sure we'll hear, news sooner rather than later about when the Rockets.
I think they would also want to beat the NFL draft that's on Thursday. So I'm thinking Wednesday ahead of the draft and all the Texans coverage is probably a good bet.
Okay, well then Wednesday afternoon, pencil that in tentatively into your schedules. But what we do have to work with right now is a little bit of footage from the vault, if you will, of Ime answering some questions about his basketball philosophy from when he was first hired as the Celtics head coach. So let's go ahead and run that back and unpack what he had to say.
The relationship piece, it's pretty much that simple. I mean, there's X's and O's, there's disciplinary, and there's accountability and all those things, but it's really relationship based. And, I watched it obviously playing with Tim, Tony, Manu, those guys as a player, and then moving over to be a coach, I saw the relationship Pop had with those guys. And that's, 15 or so years built up. And so I had to take that into my own relationships with newer guys, whether it be LaMarcus or Kawhi or Ben and Joel in Philadelphia. And you got to have your own genuine touch to that. But I learned it's really all about the relationships. Once you get their trust and show them that you love them, they'll run through a wall for you. And likewise, you want to do the same for your players.
All right, Ben. So first off, I love that messaging from Udoka, and you can kind of tell that's exactly why he's the type of coach that is able to get so much out of his players, right? He really does understand that kind of relationship building element is so important to establishing a strong relationship with those players and then building upon those principles, right? Trusting one another and then getting to a place where he understands what the players need. They understand what they need to get or what they can get out of him. And I think hearing that just is really exciting about what he's going to be able to accomplish with a young group of guys who have, again, it feels like they've sorely been missing like a leader in that locker room for quite some time.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think a lot of the success for Udoka is tied into his career as a player and his long time as a coach, not just the 1 year in Boston, but all those years with Greg Popovich in particular on contending Spurs teams. He mentioned Manu Ginobili, Tony Parker, Tim Duncan. Those are names that really resonate with young NBA players. And I think that's so critical to this Rockets group because people within the Rockets will push back on the idea that Stephen Silas was always Mr. Nice Guy. No, I mean, I'm assured that, or I've been given assurances that on the practice court, there were times when he absolutely would dress them down, that he would unload on them for lapses in effort and those types of things.
Yeah, I was there at training camp, sitting in the gym, waiting to, actually get in there for, media interviews, and Silas was yelling at these guys, tearing into them. So yeah. He wasn't always smiles and Mr. Nice Guy.
Yeah, this whole smiling Silas meme, that almost a caricature that's put out there on social media and Reddit and so on and so forth. Look, as with anything in those forums, it can be overdone. And I think with some segments of the fan base, it has been. Look, I think Stephen tried to do many of these things. It's just he did not personally have nearly the background, at least at the highest level. Now, I know he's been an assistant for a long time, and we talked a lot during the Silas years about his relationships with guys like Luka and LeBron and Steph. But for Udoka to have so much success, the 1 year with Boston, taking them to the NBA Finals, all the success during the second part of the dynasty run in San Antonio, and then being a player himself in the NBA, there's just so many different layers of credibility that he has. And that really resonates, I think, with young rosters like the one here in Houston. I think that's so important. So I think when we draw this comparison, it's important to note it's not necessarily that Stephen Silas didn't get it or didn't attempt to do some of these things, but I do think it's easier for Udoka to make those connections. And also being a player himself, he also knows the exact style and perhaps the ways, the forum to do those things that are going to be most persuasive and most likely to connect with those players. And ultimately, I think that's why Udoka ended up being the hire. He's sort of the perfect blend. The way that I described it on my podcast, The Logger Line, when I did a reaction show Monday night, of the three finalists, they were all defensive minded. We talked about going sort of the rule of opposites from Stephen Silas. So Frank Vogel, Nick Nurse, and Ime Udoka. I think Udoka is sort of a blend. Frank Vogel is someone that's very calm, very measured. He has his expectations. There's a certain way that he wants the team to play. And while there are, I suppose, standards, there is accountability. It's more or less, look, this is the Frank Vogel way. And if someone's not meeting it, then we're going to try other options. And we'll look elsewhere in the market, free agency, trades, what have you. With Nick Nurse, it's so intense. It's grating. That's the way a lot of the reports from Toronto have described his style with the Raptors over the 5 years, and this idea that he's worn out his welcome. And I think one of the concerns in Houston is that if he's this grating to where it's tough for Nick Nurse to be, I suppose, a 10-year plus coach potentially if everything goes right, then do you necessarily want this to be the start of your 3 to 5 year window when it's not like the Rockets are ready to really compete for a championship the next couple of years anyway? Because by the time the Rockets actually are a few years from now in position to win, what if Nick Nurse is starting to wear out his welcome because of how intense that style is? I think Udoka is sort of the blend. There's the calm, measured, stoic professionalism of Frank Vogel in terms of just how he carries himself. But there's also at times a willingness to be a bit more in your face, a bit more intense, like a Nick Nurse. And I think that's perhaps where his playing background and his long assistant background comes into play. He can sort of pick his spots, and he knows when the optimal moments are to show that tough side, that in your face dynamic. And so to me, you can see with those three finalists what the Rockets were looking for in terms of schematics, X's and O's going into this search. I think what gave Udoka the upper hand is his ability to sort of blend multiple styles, and that may be really useful for a roster like the current Rockets.
I love that. That's actually a really great point when you're trying to look at some of the key differences between what ultimately became what we think are kind of the three finalists, right? It's weird to consider Nurse a finalist when he didn't even get an interview, but I guess, you know, all the rumors, all the reporting suggested that he would have had the Rockets not wanted to just jump at the opportunity to get their guy in Ime Udoka. We've got one more clip here just with Ime talking about his basketball philosophy, which I think is worth replaying as well.
Yeah, first thing would be a hard-nosed physicality. You know, you want teams to kind of emulate who you were to some extent as a player, and that's who I was. But if they don't have that, you want to help rub that off onto the players to some extent. And you know, you take a team like Utah, it doesn't matter who the personnel was, you knew what they were going to be with Jae'Sean. And so some of that is what I look for, but also, you know, unselfish basketball, selfless players. And you know, I was around one of the biggest with Tim, you know, one of the greatest power forwards of all time, is probably the most selfless individual I've known, especially for a superstar Hall of Famer. And so you try to encourage guys to be that. And, you know, obviously Jason, Jalen, and some of the young guys we have are foundational pieces. And so just help them grow, push them to be great and achieve their potential. And they're all asking for that. And I'll be happy to obviously be the next guy to push them in that direction.
Okay, so I love that he highlights just obviously, right, we associate Ime with being this hard-nosed defense-first kind of guy, coach, and I love that he highlights it, but also isn't afraid to say, hey, like if a player isn't quite that, right, I want to help him get there. Because when you look at so many of the players on this Rockets roster, there might be some untapped potential here when you look at guys like a Jalen or a Kevin who have shown some flashes, some moments where where they can be locked in and impactful defensively, but they just haven't always been motivated to be that locked in and engaged 24/7 because the expectations haven't been there, right? Where they haven't been pushed by somebody to want to give their all on that end of the floor. We've heard constantly Jalen talking about wanting to be a two-way player. Kevin has talked about defense a lot, and we've seen some very interesting moments where Kevin matches up against smaller players, bigger guys, like, you know, hypothetically, he should be a good defensive player pretty consistently. Yeah. So you talk about that effort side and then also the selflessness on the other side of the basketball. And those are two of the key areas when you look at so many of the gripes and complaints about this last season, right? What was it? Lack of effort and accountability on the defensive end especially. And then at times, some really selfish basketball being played offensively. So at least on the surface, hearing Ime say those things is really exciting because those address two of the biggest issues from this previous Rockets team.
Yeah, absolutely. And when we get to the press conference, whatever it is, again, my guess is Wednesday. One of the things that I'm most interested in hearing from Ime about is his views of the current roster. To me, that's sort of the big question mark in this. And of course, he's expressed those behind the scenes with Rafael Stone, but I'm curious what he'll say. Because when you look at any coach's philosophies, especially in a small sample, he just had the 1 year in Boston, it's tough to say exactly what, in terms of X's and O's, is Ime Udoka ball and what is trying to blend Ime Udoka ball to the roster that he has. And so how these players fit into that, I think that's a big part of the puzzle that we don't have info yet. And I'm not saying that he's going to share everything. Certainly there's discretion. Anyone is smart in a press conference setting, but I think that might shed some light on what this offseason looks like and who on this current roster is potentially a bigger piece of the puzzle moving forward. Because, yeah, it's not just about a certain set of schemes and being rigid. No, any great coach can adapt his system to incorporate the best of the players that he has and their skill sets. And so how he can sort of tailor what he does to this group of Rockets, to me, that's the piece of the puzzle that we want to learn more about from a basketball perspective. Now, I know there's all the baggage, and that'll be talked about at the press conference too, although, spoiler alert, he's going to show remorse. If he wasn't showing remorse, he wouldn't have gotten this far in the process. To me, the more interesting storyline is actually what happens on the basketball side with this current group and what can he unlock in them. And I'm pretty optimistic. You know, there were some superficial takes on Twitter I saw in the immediate aftermath of the Udoka hire that Udoka might not be good for Alperen Sengun, given the emphasis on physical defense. And yet there's strong reporting from the 2021 draft that the Celtics were going to take Alperen Sengun if he was on the board for them, that they were very interested. And that was when Ime Udoka was the head coach. They were looking into playing Sengun and Robert Williams as their center duo. So I think that's very intriguing, not even 2 years later, that, again, the superficial takes might not be reality. There's different ways you can use people. There's different skill sets. And I think we need to go into this with an open mind and let him sort of explain his vision for not just what his principles are, but how his principles can potentially mesh with the current Rockets roster, this young core that's already in place, as they try to unlock the best versions of those guys.
Later this week, we're going to unpack with our other weekly co-host, Ali Kambajani, some of the defensive possibilities with Ime Udoka, Alperen Sengun, and how the Celtics might have actually used Alpi had they drafted him. Some of the plans there, possibly some parallels, some similarities. We'll also, of course, have you covered for whenever the introductory press conference takes place. We'll run back clips, highlights of it, all that stuff here at Locked on Rockets. But Ben, do us all a favor, let everybody know where they can track you down at.
Yep. Ben DuBose on Twitter, the Rockets Wire on Twitter, the Logger Line on Twitter, and rocketswire.usatoday.com for all of your daily Houston Rockets news coverage.
That's going to do it for another edition of Locked on Rockets. As always, thank you so much for checking out the show. If you haven't done so yet, please consider subscribing wherever you listen to your podcasts. That's Apple, Spotify, Google, Odyssey app, free and available wherever you listen to your podcasts. We're also on YouTube. Just go to YouTube, search Locked on Rockets. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Let me know if you're an everyday listener of the show. If you're an everydayer, drop a comment in the YouTube section. But as always, thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for listening. And we look forward to having you back right here at Locked on Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball.